Okay, we're going to pick up with transport of gases, and let me point out two things here. Right there is your lung blood interface, and down here is your blood tissue interface. So remember, up here, lung blood, that's called external respiration. And down here at the blood tissue site, that transport of gases is called internal respiration. Okay, so this is your alveolus right there, and here's your blood vessel. Notice the blood flow. Let me get rid of the bar there. All right. Unfortunately, I can't get rid of that bar at the top. Huh. Well, there. Okay. All right. So, here's your venous blood coming down this way. All right. Now, the bar is gone. So, venous blood coming down this way. All right. And obviously it's going to pick up oxygen. Now, look at the blue arrow. Notice your PO2 there in the alveolus. It's high. It's because you just inhaled it. And your PO2 over here in the venous blood is lower. And oxygen diffuses from high PO2 to low across the respiratory membrane. There it goes. Once the oxygen goes in there, remember, more oxygen that goes in there, the higher the concentration of oxygen will be, correct? And remember that the partial pressure is equal to percentage of the gas times the total pressure. So if you add in a higher concentration of oxygen diffusing across, look what happens to the PO2. It goes up from 40 to 100 as it takes in more oxygen. Now, look down here at the tissue site. And here's PO2 in the arterial blood coming down. It's got its oxygen load at 95. And the PO2 in the tissues is 40. It's low because remember, the tissue cells are using oxygen as fast as they can get it. They're doing aerobic respiration. It requires oxygen. So notice again the blue arrow. We start at PO2 at 95. In the tissues it's 40. Oxygen diffuses across, and if you follow the blood going down this way, look what happens to the PO2. It drops to 40 because the oxygen is moved out. Now if you look at the CO2, the opposite is happening. So if you, again, let's go down over here to tissues. That's where the CO2 is made, so let's start there. Your PCO2 is 45 in the cells. That's where they're making it. It's a waste product of aerobic respiration. Your PCO2 in arterial blood is 40. It's not a big jump from 45 down to 40, but all you need is a drop for CO2 to cross over. And that increases then the PCO2 in the venous blood higher than it was over here in arterial blood. Now, it's carried by the blood. We get back to the lungs and look at the venous blood here, high in CO2, 45. But inside the alveolus, it's 40 because you're always blowing it out. And the CO2 crosses over. And really, that's about it. And on the graph down here at the bottom, you can see that it's kind of off the scale here, but this is PO2 right there on the y-axis. And it's just showing you that at the arteriolar end of the capillary, it's picking up oxygen. By the way, these are arterioles becoming capillary beds around the alveoli. So as the PO2, as the oxygen level goes up, as it goes through the capillary, we get down over here, we're at max oxygen down here at the end. Remember, we're starting with venous blood that is low in oxygen, even though it is called a arterial. And down at the end here, remember, this is the oxygen pickup in the vessels around the alveolar. This is arterial blood, even though this is the venial end of the capillary. Kind of freaky, but that's the way it is. There's a really nice website for an animation you might want to go to. Okay, so let's move along here, and let's start with oxygen. It's pretty simple. Okay, so 97% of oxygen is picked up by hemoglobin. And when the two come together, remember 4 oxygens are picked up by hemoglobin, bound to it, you get oxyhemoglobin. This formula, going to the right, is hemoglobin saturation, going to the right. That is the pickup of oxygen by hemoglobin. And the key factor driving it? High PO2. So remember, this is at the lung, blood area. That's where your PO2 is going to be the highest. So this represents the respiratory membrane up here. Okay, now that oxyhemoglobin is carried around in the body, and we get over now to the tissues, where the PO2 is going to be lower because the tissues are always using oxygen. And when the PO2 drops, the oxyhemoglobin now splits apart or dissociates back down to free hemoglobin and free oxygen. And now the oxygen can cross over the respiratory membrane and go into an alveolus and then is blown out. So the key factor here in the rate of release of oxygen is PO2, high or low PO2. Now, temperature and pH. Let's say you're doing bicep curls and you're really contracting muscle. The temperature would be warmer, and because of cell respiration, the pH would be lower. Remember all the acids of glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. And these two things contribute to the breakdown or dissociation of oxyhemoglobin to free oxygen and hemoglobin. In other words, they act along with low PO2 in getting oxyhemoglobin to split back to oxygen. So when you're using weights with a bicep curl, your muscle is metabolizing a lot, and you need more free oxygen for that muscle to work, and the oxyhemoglobin splits. Other things that can have an effect, biphosphoglycerate, or BPG, sometimes called DPG for diphosphoglycerate. This is a chemical found in blood cells, and it basically determines the amount of drop-off, is one of the things that determines the drop-off of oxyhemoglobin to oxygen and to free hemoglobin. So if you have a lot of that, you get more of a split. Okay, one last thing. Carbon monoxide, CO. Don't confuse it with CO2. If you are in a fire and there's a lot of carbon monoxide around the place, let's say you're a hemoglobin molecule and you have in front of you one oxygen molecule, one carbon monoxide molecule, the CO will be the one that's picked up. It has a 200 times greater binding affinity for hemoglobin than oxygen. It binds on the iron in the heme group at the exact same place that oxygen does. So in other words, it deprives hemoglobin from picking up oxygen. The CO is carried by the blood gets to the tissues, but there is no oxygen getting to the tissues because the CO has bound the hemoglobin, preventing it from carrying oxygen. So carbon monoxide poisoning is kind of a misnomer in that it doesn't really poison or kill cells directly, doesn't do any damage to red blood cells. It prevents the blood from getting its oxygen load to the tissue cells, and so they are starved of oxygen. Okay, that's gas transport. Let's go on to CO2. Well, before that, let's look at the hemoglobin saturation curve. Okay, this shows you a relationship between the amount of oxyhemoglobin being formed or broken down and the PO2. Now, if you look at the y-axis on the left, over here on the left, you go up this way, we're forming oxyhemoglobin. You go down this way, it's splitting into oxygen plus hemoglobin, right? So it's forming it's forming oxyhemoglobin going up, it's dissociating and breaking down, going down. Alright, so let's start over here at the blue line. So as you're sitting here resting, you're taking a lot of oxygen in, and the PO2 inside the alveoli is going to be around 90. And if you go up to this red line, look at the red line first, right there. If you look at this red line and then go over to the y-axis, you're at about 95% oxyhemoglobin. So at rest, you're taking a lot of oxygen. Bunches of oxyhemoglobin is forming. Very little of it is being freed up or dissociated into free oxygen. Now, it's carried to the tissues, and let's say you're just kind of mildly doing a few little items, I don't know, maybe moving around, walking, whatever. And let's say that your PO2 level at that site is 40. Go up to the red line, and you're now at about 75% saturation of hemoglobin, 75% oxyhemoglobin. If you've got about 75% formation of hemoglobin, oxyhemoglobin, that means you've got about 25% that is dissociating or breaking down into free oxygen and hemoglobin. But again, you still got enough even at 75%. Now, let's say you get up and do jumping jacks for 10 minutes, if that's possible. Let's say that your PO2 drops down to 20. Notice that when you got to about the 40, maybe even 50, this begins to really drop quickly. So at 20 now, if you go over to the y-axis, look at your oxyhemoglobin being formed. It's not. It's freeing up oxygen. Remember, down arrow means instead of forming oxyhemoglobin, it's splitting up to free up oxygen to get to the cells. That's what this curve tells you. Now, before we leave it, look at the blue line and notice that this is the binding affinity of fetal hemoglobin that you make as a fetus. So, let's say that you're resting right now. No, you're doing some mild walking around on something, and your PO2 is 40. Remember that this was about 75% oxyhemoglobin. All right. But let's say that you are moving around, but you're a fetus, and your PO2 is 40. Well, your oxyhemoglobin is at 90%. In other words, fetal hemoglobin binds any free oxygen molecules much better, much more efficiently than non-fetal hemoglobin. In other words, to get the same amount, 75%, the PO2 in the fetus could actually be about 25, and you'd still get around 75% oxyhemoglobin. So again, there can be less oxygen in the fetus, and because it has a different kind of hemoglobin, it will pick up the oxygen molecules more effectively. So look at the bottom line here. This is the point I had made earlier. If you become more active, again look at this yellow line, the cells need more oxygen. Hemoglobin has lots of oxygen to give up. It's going to dissociate into free oxygen. Okay. Look at the temperature. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. Temperature chart on the left. Here is body temperature at the purple line. If it gets warmer, if your body temperature goes up, you get a shift to the right, and the oxyhemoglobin will start to break down easier. Remember, when you're exercising, that's what's going to happen. So you can understand why your cells need more oxygen. You can understand why your oxyhemoglobin splits easier into free oxygen for it to get into the cells. When it's colder, the oxyhemoglobin is less likely to split apart, and it stays bound with the oxygen. Now, look at the right graph, and you're looking at pH. And I should point out that it also has PCO2. CO2 contributes to acidity. We'll talk about this more later, in fact, in the next slide or two. But for right now, you need to know that when CO2 goes up, acidity goes up, which, remember, means a drop in pH. High acid, low pH. Okay, keep it in mind. All right, so let's start with the norm. The norm is this purple line. This is at a normal pH of 7.4 blood, normal CO2 and all that. All right, so if you're exercising and you get more acids, your pH is going to drop from 7.4. It'll go down. Let's say in this scenario it says 7.2. Your PCO2 is higher than normal. It was 40 normal. It's now 80. And you get a shift to the right, which again means the shift to the right is this red line, that the oxyhemoglobin now more easily splits into oxygen and hemoglobin. Again, the cells are doing more, metabolizing more. They're making more acid. They need more oxygen, obviously, to metabolize. If your blood is more alkaline, then you're going to have this blue line. This is called a shift to the left. The oxyhemoglobin binds more tightly to the oxygen. By the way, this pH effect that you're looking at right here, particularly in acid, it's called the Bohr effect. So this scenario right here is the Bohr effect. Okay, and this is basically what I just told you about. Okay, CO2. Bigger problem. More involved. All right. So let's go the easy way first. Remember, we're at the tissues now, because that's where the CO2 is made. All right. CO2 comes out of the cells, crosses over the membranes of the cell and the blood cell, and it comes in contact with hemoglobin. Remember, it's not binding at the same site that oxygen, it's binding on the polypeptide chains, not heme. And what's driving these two guys together to form carbaminohemoglobin is high PCO2. And you always find high PCO2 at the tissue site. Now, only about 23-25% of CO2 is carried this way. Only about a quarter. Okay, another 7% or so is just dissolved in plasma. It's just floating along. Okay, so now we're at like 32%. Okay, we still have 2/3 of the CO2. So let me get rid of those. And Trying to get rid of that line right there. Alright. Okay, so let's go down here to this 65 to 70% of the CO2 that's left. The stuff that doesn't get turned into carbaminohemoglobin and the stuff that's not dissolved in plasma is going to get converted to bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is HCO3, negative charge. Look at the formula here. CO2 combines with water, forms carbonic acid. By the way, this means that reaction can go either way. Carbonic acid is unstable. Again, you got a two-way reaction, and it will lightly split into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. There's your bicarbonate right there. Okay, let me show you that in more detail. Alright, so what you see here is a red blood cell, this big guy right here. So we're out in the plasma. So the CO2 has come out of the cells into the interstitial fluid. It's moved into the blood. It's in the plasma. It moves into a CO2. Into the red blood cell. Remember, it's high PCO2 that shifts it. By the way, the oxygen partial pressure has no effect on CO2. Well, little effect. And vice versa. PCO2 has no effect on oxygen. Alright, so here's our CO2. The 70% shifts into a red blood cell. It is going to react with water, because remember, 70% of a cell is water. It becomes carbonic acid, H2CO3, which is unstable, which splits into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. Now, the hydrogen ion would be a problem in a cell because that's going to make the cell fluid acidic. So it actually binds to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin actually acts as a buffer. It picks up the hydrogen ion, and so it doesn't affect the pH in the cell. Now, this bicarbonate, HCO3, it goes out of the cell. We're now back into the plasma. There's your bicarbonate right there. And it's going to be involved in buffering blood plasma to keep the blood pH 7.4. Now, notice that there's a negative charge on that bicarb. You don't want huge amounts of negatively charged ions leaving the cell. That can cause an imbalance. So instead, what we're going to have is a shift of chloride ions, which also have a negative charge, from the plasma into the cell. This is called the chloride shift. You see that right here, what I just mentioned, right down there. So I've given you two different ways to look at it. This is a picture out of your lab book showing everything I've gone over. Up here at the top, is oxygen transport, again starting at the lungs right here, and as you're shifting that way, the oxygen is getting over to the tissues. There are the tissues right over there. For the CO2, start the CO2 over here. There's your movement of CO2 into the venous blood, carried back to the lungs. There's your lung site, and then getting dumped and exhaled. Okay, we're going to stop there. That's enough for you to digest. And the last section will be on regulation and finishing up.